The papers scattered across the grass like startled birds. Mr. Sterling, the land agent from the county seat, held them down with a hand too clean for the dust-choked air. His smile was a thin, dry line. Behind him, the men of Provisional stood in a silent, uneasy crescent, their faces grim under the brutal August sun. Elara stood alone before them, her hands loose at her sides, her gaze fixed not on Sterling's triumphant face but on the land itself. The land was the whole point. The cattle were gone. All 63 of them, driven off an hour ago by Sterling's men. He called it a repossession, a legal seizure. He claimed the beasts were collateral on a debt that was, by his new and creative accounting, suddenly past due. But it wasn't about the cattle. It was never about the cattle. It was about the miracle they had wrought. Where 120 acres of sucking mud and willow thicket had been, there was now a wide, firm channel of dark earth, flanked by drying banks. The sunken mill race, lost for a generation, lay exposed to the sky like an ancient secret. It was empty. That was the other part of Sterling's victory. The spring that fed it had finally dwindled to nothing in the pitiless drought, and the channel that had held water all summer was now just a ditch. He had waited for this, waited for her one advantage to evaporate. "As you can see," Sterling said, his voice carrying in the still air, "the property is now dry, a significant improvement for which the county thanks you. However, as the original survey was improperly filed, and as this channel constitutes a historical waterway," he let the words hang. He was taking the land. He had the papers, the men, and the law on his side. Or so he believed. The town watched, their silence a heavy shroud of shame and fear. They had laughed at her. Now they depended on her, and she had failed them. One person alone. It was not enough. 2 springs earlier, Elara had arrived in Provisional with little more than a mule, a canvas satchel, and the deed to her late uncle's folly. The town, what there was of it, was a single dusty street of false-fronted buildings, squinting in the prairie sun. The word was already out. She was the niece of Mad Anson, the fool who had died trying to farm a swamp. She went to the clerk's office to settle the estate. The clerk, a man whose jowls quivered with what he thought was sympathy, laid out the papers. 120 acres, encumbered by a $90 lien for back taxes. "You can just sign it over to the county, miss," he'd said, his tone oozing pity. "No one will think less of you. It's worthless land. Always has been." He called it the Willow-Flood, a basin of low-lying ground choked with willows and cattails, fed by a spring no one could find, and drained by a creek that silted up every winter. In the spring it was a lake. By summer it was a sucking, mosquito-thick mire. "You'd do better to sleep in the street than try to sleep there," the blacksmith told her later, spitting a brown stream of tobacco juice near her worn boots. The mockery was thick and constant, dressed as concern. A young woman alone, what could she possibly do with a swamp? They saw a girl, barely 20, with hands too slender for farm work, and a quietness they mistook for weakness. Elara listened to it all, her face as still as pond water. She'd spent her life being underestimated. It was a language she understood. She counted out the $90 in worn bills and silver on the clerk's desk. The man stared at the money as if it were poison. "You're paying the lien?" he stammered. "You're keeping it?" Elara nodded, her gaze steady. "It's mine now." The clerk stamped the deed with a heavy, final thud. The sound echoed in the small room. Outside, the whispers followed her down the street. Mad Anson's niece, throwing good money after bad. The town had passed its judgment. She had lost her mind before she had even set foot on her new land. Her first week was spent walking the perimeter. The good high ground, where her uncle's cabin tilted like a tired old man, was a scant 3 acres. Below it, the land fell away into the green morass of the Willow-Flood. The air was thick with the smell of decay and the drone of insects. The willows grew in an impenetrable thicket, their branches woven together. It did look hopeless. She spent her days in the county records office, poring over old survey maps until her eyes ached. They showed the parcel as Lot 7, a square chunk of land with a creek running through it. The older maps, from 50 years prior, were different. They showed a thin, straight line cutting across the lot, labeled simply Mill Race. The town of Provisional had once been Provisional Mill, but the mill had burned down in the Great Fire of '48, and the race that fed it from a deep wood spring had been forgotten, left to silt up and vanish beneath the mud and the relentless march of the willows. Hunger changes a town. A fire changes it faster. The memory of the race had been buried under the more immediate need to survive. Elara took her uncle's longest-sounding pole and began to wade into the swamp. The water was cold, the mud a greedy, sucking thing that tried to steal her boots. Day after day, she pushed through the willows, poling the ground beneath the murky water. Mostly, it was soft, bottomless silt, but then, in a line that ran unnaturally straight through the heart of the basin, the pole would strike something hard, a dull thud that vibrated up the wood and into her hands. Stone, dressed stone. She found the edge of it, then another edge, 20 feet away. Channel, buried under 4 feet of mud, but it was there. That evening, as she sat on her cabin steps cleaning the mud from her clothes, a figure came walking slowly up the path. He was old, with a back bent from a lifetime of labor, and eyes the pale, washed-out blue of a winter sky. It was Jakob, her nearest neighbor, a German immigrant who farmed the high ground a mile to the east. He held a small loaf of dark bread in one hand. He did not offer pity or advice. He just watched her for a long moment. "The land always remembers what it was meant to do," he said, his voice a low, accented rumble. "You only have to listen." He handed her the bread. "The old maps are true. My grandfather helped dig that race. He said the stone was cut so fine you could not slip a knife blade between the blocks. It ran straight and fast." He pointed a gnarled finger toward the swamp. "The willows tell the story. They grow straightest where the banks were highest. They follow the line." Elara looked. He was right. There was a subtle order to the chaos, a faint corridor of taller, straighter trees. She had been feeling for the bottom. She should have been looking at the top. "How do I clear it?" she asked, her voice quiet. He shrugged, a slow lift of his bony shoulders. 100 men with shovels, or 1,000 years of patience. He looked at her, then at her slender frame. "Or, you find a different kind of shovel. A different kind of shovel." The words echoed in her head for days. She had $90 to her name, a cabin that leaked, and a swamp. She had no money for a crew of men. She had no time for 1,000 years of patience. She sat on her porch each evening, doing the arithmetic of survival. The cost of seed for the high ground, the cost of flour to last the winter, the cost of a new axe head. The numbers were grim. They always came up short. One morning, she was watching the few feral cows that roamed the county graze near the edge of the swamp. They ventured into the shallows to drink, their heavy bodies sinking into the mud, their hooves churning the black muck into a slurry. When they pulled themselves out, they left behind deep, water-filled craters. They were engines of entropy. They were living shovels. The idea took root, a tiny, impossible seed of a plan: cattle. Not to raise for beef, not to milk, but to use as a tool, to trample the swamp into submission. She went to see Mr. Sterling, the cattle agent whose office was the grandest building in Provisional. He was a man who smelled of soap and leather, his fingernails clean, his ledger books immaculate. He bought and sold the lifeblood of the prairie, and he knew the precise worth of everything. He laughed when she told him what she wanted. Not a cruel laugh, but a soft, patronizing chuckle. "Miss," he said, leaning back in his chair, "you want the culls, the mud devils, the ones no rancher will even claim?" That's exactly what she wanted. The heaviest, boniest, most worthless cattle he had. The ones with big feet and bad tempers. "A woman alone has no business with cattle," he said, the smile never leaving his face. "They'll run you right into that swamp of yours and leave you there." "I'll take a dozen," she said, her voice betraying no emotion. the heaviest you can get. He saw the glint of determination in her eye, and his amusement turned to shrewd business. He named a price that was insultingly high for such worthless animals, but still within the last of her savings. He thought she was a fool, and he was happy to take a fool's money. 2 days later, a boy from his office drove 12 gaunt, wild-eyed steers and heifers to her gate. They were a sorry sight, ribs showing, hides scarred, their horns chipped. The town turned out to watch. It was the best entertainment they'd had all year. "Look at that!" the blacksmith crowed to his friends. "She's gonna raise mud devils in a mud hole. She'll be lucky if she don't drown with them." Elara ignored them. She paid the boy, closed the gate, and looked at her new herd. They stared back, their eyes full of suspicion. They were ugly and mean and half-starved. They were perfect. The first task was fencing. She couldn't have her living shovels wandering off. She spent 2 weeks cutting and setting posts, stringing the wire she'd bought with the last of her cash. She worked from before dawn until the light failed, her hands blistering, then callousing, then turning as tough as bark. The town watched her toil, shaking their heads. They saw a woman engaged in a pointless, back-breaking folly. They did not see the meticulous geometry of her fence line, which didn't enclose the whole swamp, but a specific 100-foot-wide corridor. The line Jakob's grandfather had helped dig, the line the Willows remembered. Then came the work itself. Each morning she would open the gate and drive the 12 cattle into the enclosed section of the swamp. They hated it. They would balk and turn, but hunger was a great persuader. The only grazing was on the other side. To get there, they had to cross the mud. The sound began. A wet, percussive slopping and sucking that echoed across the basin. The cattle, sinking to their hocks, sometimes to their bellies, churned the black gumbo with every step. They were slow, heavy, and relentless. They were magnificent. Day after day, the routine was the same. Drive them in, let them churn their way across, drive them back. At night, she would collapse onto her cot, every muscle screaming, the sound of sucking mud still ringing in her ears. A boy started watching her. He was small and silent, with eyes that saw everything. His name was Finn, the farrier's youngest son, a child lost in a world of his own. He would sit on the high ground for hours, motionless, just observing the strange drama in the basin below. One afternoon, he came down the hill and, without a word, handed Elara a bucket of fresh water from her well. From then on, he was a fixture. He never spoke, but his presence was a quiet comfort. He would help her mend the fence, clear rocks from the high pasture, and watch the cattle with an intensity that matched her own. He seemed to understand, in a way the adults could not, that this was not madness, this was work. By June, the first section of the corridor was a sea of black, liquid mud. The willows, their roots disturbed and drowned, began to yellow. Elara moved the fences, enclosing the next 100-foot stretch. She sold 2 of her uncle's old tools to afford another coil of wire. The arithmetic was always there, a wolf at the door. But now, there was a counter-calculation, the slow, steady lowering of the mud. It was working. It was agonizingly slow, but it was working. She bought more cattle. Another 8 head from Sterling, who was now openly amused by her persistence. "Building your army, are you?" he'd asked. The town had a new name for her land, Elara's Folly, or, more cruelly, the Cow Drowner. They did not see the change. They only saw the mess. But Elara saw it, and Finn saw it. The water level was dropping, the churned mud was consolidating, growing denser, the land was breathing out. By the 3rd week of July, the cattle's hooves began to strike stone more frequently. Not just the dull thud she had felt with the pole, but a sharp, grating clack. It was the sound of progress, the most beautiful sound in the world. She began working at night. After Finn had gone home and the town was asleep, she would take a lantern and a shovel down into the churned corridor. The cattle had done the heavy work of displacing the mud. Her job was to clear it away. She would wade into the thigh-deep slurry and begin to dig. The first time her shovel scraped against the flat, dressed surface of a paving stone, She dropped to her knees in the muck, tears mixing with the swamp water on her face. It was real. It was all real. She cleared a small patch, 3 feet square. The stones were massive, fitted together with a mason's precision. Between them was not mortar, but a fine, watertight seal of blue clay. She ran her rough hands over the surface, feeling the cool, solid truth of it. This was her secret, her treasure. She kept it like a coal banked low under ash, hiding her progress from the world. During the day, it was just a mud pit. At night, it was the slow unveiling of a lost marvel. Finn, who sometimes stayed late, would hold the lantern for her. He never asked what she was looking for. He simply watched, his small face illuminated in the golden light, as the channel slowly emerged from its muddy grave. He had taken to calling the lead cow, a big-boned heifer with a calm demeanor, Queen. It was the first time Elara had heard him speak a full word. He would whisper it to the cow when he brought her a handful of clover. Queen and her subjects, the comic dignity of the animals, their unwitting, monumental labor, was not lost on Elara. They were her partners, her ridiculous, 4-legged saviors. She began buying more cattle whenever she could, selling off anything of value from the cabin. A silverback mirror, her uncle's pocket watch. Each sale was another 2 or 3 head of heavy-footed shovels. By August, she had 40 cattle. The process accelerated. The sound of their churning filled the valley. The town's mockery began to curdle into a different kind of attention, a grudging, confused curiosity. The mess was getting bigger, but it was also getting lower. The water that had pooled in the basin for a generation was being displaced, squeezed out, and the creek at the far end of the swamp was running thick and brown with the runoff. The land was sinking, or rather, the memory of the land was rising. August arrived like the open door of a furnace. The sky turned a hard, cloudless blue. The prairie grass cured from green to gold to a brittle, dusty brown. The creek that drained the Willow-Flood slowed to a trickle, then vanished, leaving a cracked bed of mud. But the spring that fed the basin, deep and ancient, still seeped into the head of the uncovered mill race. While the rest of the county withered, a channel of cool, clear water began to form in the path the cattle had cleared. It was perhaps a foot deep and 20 feet wide, but it was water, clean, moving water. The willows on the newly exposed banks, their roots now in dry air, died off, leaving behind firm, accessible ground. Elara had not just uncovered a ditch, she had restored a waterway. The town fell silent. The laughter stopped completely. Now, when they looked down into the basin, they saw a miracle. They saw a wide, green ribbon of life running through a parched landscape. Mr. Sterling's buggy became a common sight on the road overlooking her property. His expression was no longer amused. It was the tight, focused look of a man doing complicated sums in his head. One afternoon, he drove down her lane. He hitched his horse and walked to where she was strengthening a section of fence. He took off his hat, a gesture of respect that was entirely false. "Miss," he began, his voice smooth as butter, "you have worked a wonder here. A true wonder. You've taken a worthless piece of land and made it valuable?" He gestured to the channel. "But it's a heavy burden for a woman alone to manage. I would be willing to take it off your hands, for a fair price, of course, for the trouble you've gone to." He named a number. It was 5 times what she had paid for the land, a fortune to her. But it was a pittance for what the land was now worth. It was the price of a problem, not the price of a solution. Elara looked from his clean, soft hands to her own, which were calloused and stained with earth. She thought of the nights spent in the mud, the gnawing hunger, the chorus of mockery. She thought of Finn's silent companionship and Jakob's quiet wisdom. "It's not for sale, Mr. Sterling," she said, her voice even. He stared at her, his mask of false warmth slipping for just a second. He saw not a fool or a girl, but an owner, an obstacle. "Everything is for sale, miss," he said, his voice hardening almost imperceptibly. "It's only a matter of finding the right price." He put his hat back on. turned without another word, and drove away. The dust his buggy kicked up hung in the air long after he was gone. A threat had been made, not with words, but with a look. He would be back. The drought tightened its grip. The sun was a merciless hammer. The wells in Provisional began to run low. Then the town's main creek, the lifeblood of their pastures, shrank to a string of muddy pools. Panic, a low, quiet hum at first, began to grow. Men who had laughed at Elara's folly now stood on the high road, staring down at the impossible green of her land, at the clear water flowing in her channel, at her cattle grazing peacefully on the lush banks. Their own herds stood listless in cracked, barren fields, their heads low, their tongues thick with thirst. The fortune inversion was complete. The thing they had scorned was now the only thing of value. The worthless land was the only land with water. Elara, in her poverty, was now the wealthiest person for 50 miles, measured in the currency of survival. She did the arithmetic again. She had over 60 head of cattle now, all fat and healthy. The land was secure. The water was flowing. She had won. But being right is its own kind of burden. One evening, a man came walking up her path. It was Henderson, a proud, hard-faced farmer who had been one of her loudest mockers. He held his hat in his hands, turning it over and over. His face was a mask of defeat. "Miss," he said, his voice raspy. He couldn't meet her eyes. "My well is dry. My herd, they ain't had a proper drink in 2 days." He finally looked at her, and she saw not a bully, but a man terrified of losing everything he had ever worked for. "I know I got no right to ask, but could I water my stock? I'll pay." Here was the moment. She could have named any price. She could have savored her victory, repaid his scorn with ruin. The town was watching. They expected her to be as cruel as they had been. She looked at Henderson's cracked hands, so much like her own. She looked at the desperation in his eyes. Generosity is a quiet kind of power. "The price is 1 cent a head, per day," she said. "You drive them down at sunrise and out by noon." The man stared at her, dumbfounded. The price was nothing. It was a token, a gesture that allowed him to keep his pride. It was not charity. It was business, fair business. Tears welled in his eyes. He nodded, unable to speak, and walked away with the stride of a man who had been given a reprieve from the gallows. The next day, his herd came. The day after, 2 more of his neighbors came, their faces etched with the same shame and gratitude. Elara met them all with the same calm fairness. 1 cent a head, sunrise to noon. She was not their savior. She was a businesswoman with a valuable resource, but in her fairness, she became their salvation. The town that had mocked her now depended on her. Their survival was tied to the folly they had laughed at, and to the grace of the woman they had dismissed. The steady stream of cattle to her land did not go unnoticed. It was a public declaration of her victory and Sterling's miscalculation. He had sold her the worthless tools, confident they would ruin her. Instead, they had made her. His envy, a cold and patient thing, now hardened into a plan. He could not buy her land, so he would take it. He spent a week at the county seat, in the same records office where Elara had found the old maps. He returned not with a checkbook, but with a surveyor and a sheaf of legal papers. This was the scene that opened the story. Sterling, triumphant, the town, fearful, Elara, alone. He had found a loophole, a flaw in a survey from 1852. He claimed the original parcel description was ambiguous. He argued that since the mill race had once served the public good, it was, in fact, a public right-of-way that had been illegally abandoned. His petition to the county was to have it declared a public utility, to be managed for the good of the drought-stricken region, managed, of course, by an appointed agent, himself. "It's a magnificent piece of engineering," he said to the assembled crowd, his voice dripping with false admiration as he gestured to the empty channel. "Far too complex for one person to have uncovered. You must have had help, miss." He smiled. "And how did you know the count of my cattle?" Elara asked, her voice quiet but clear. Sterling's smile faltered. In his haste to seize the land, he had repossessed her herd that morning, and in his anger, he had named the exact number, 63, a number only she and Finn knew. He had revealed his own obsessive surveillance. He recovered quickly. A good agent knows his business. The point is, this land, this water, belongs to the people, not to one person who stumbled upon it. He held up his papers. The county court agrees. They've issued a temporary injunction, placing the property under my stewardship. It was a masterstroke of bureaucratic theft. He was using the town's own desperation as a weapon against the one person who had helped them. The townsfolk shifted, their faces a mixture of guilt and impotence. They had drunk her water. Their cattle were alive because of her. And now they were standing by as this smooth-talking man stole it all. One person alone. The phrase echoed in Elara's mind. That was his whole argument, that she was insufficient, that she could not have done it, could not manage it, did not deserve it. And looking at the faces of the men before her, she felt the truth of it. One person alone was not enough. Then, a voice cut through the heavy silence. That's a lie. It was Henderson. He stepped forward from the crowd, his face grim. He was no longer a man begging for water. He was a man defending a neighbor. She didn't stumble on it. We all watched her work. We watched her wade in that muck day after day. We watched her build the fences. We called her a fool for it, and we were the fools. Another voice, a woman's this time. Our children drank that water when our own well was full of sand. She gave it to us. More voices joined in, a rising murmur of dissent. The chorus of mockers was transforming into a chorus of witnesses. They were telling the story, bearing witness to the work they had scorned. Sterling's face tightened. This was not how it was supposed to go. The grateful peasants were supposed to be grateful to him, their new savior. This is a matter of law, not sentiment, he snapped, waving the papers. She has no legal standing. She has this, a new voice said, a low, familiar rumble. Old Jacob was walking slowly through the crowd, which parted for him like the sea. In his hand, he held a brittle, yellowed roll of canvas. My grandfather was a German engineer. He did not trust paper. He trusted linen, and he trusted the law. He walked past Sterling and stood beside Elara. He carefully unrolled the canvas on the ground. It was a map, drawn in faded ink, but exquisitely detailed. It was the original plat of Provisional Mill, from before the fire. It showed Lot 7, and it showed the mill race, clearly marked with dimensions and depths. At the bottom, in precise, elegant script, were the words, "Said channel, and all water rights appertaining thereto, are the private and perpetual property of the owner of Lot 7, to be maintained by said owner for their sole use." It was signed and sealed by the original territorial governor. It was not a copy from the county records. It was the proprietor's original deed map, passed down from Jacob's grandfather. It was a document whose authority was absolute. "The land remembers," Jacob said, looking not at Sterling, but at Elara, his pale blue eyes full of warmth. "And the law, sometimes, it also remembers." Sterling stared at the map, his face ashen. He had been outwitted not by a clever lawyer, but by an old farmer and a piece of cloth. The crowd was silent for a beat, and then someone started to clap. It was Henderson. Then another, and another, until the air was filled with applause. It wasn't for the victory over Sterling. It was for her, for the quiet, stubborn woman who had seen value where they saw waste, and who had shown them grace when they deserved none. Sterling, defeated, rolled up his worthless papers. He turned to his men. "Give her back the cattle," he snarled, his voice low and venomous. He did not look at Elara again. He got into his buggy and drove away, a man diminished, his clean clothes covered in the dust of his own failure. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the valley, a small hand slipped into Elara's. It was Finn. He looked up at her, then at the cheering townsfolk, then back at the empty channel. He pointed toward the head of the race, where the spring seeped from the hillside. "Look," he whispered. From the dark, damp earth, a fresh surge of water was bubbling up, catching the last golden light. The drought had broken. The spring, deep and patient, was returning. The water began to trickle down the stone channel, a silver thread in the dusk. Elara knelt and dipped her hand in it. It was cold and clean. She had not just reclaimed a piece of land, she had bound a community together. She had taught them the value of patience and the power of a single, unwavering vision. The cattle came trotting back down the lane, lowing softly, led by Queen herself. They headed for the channel, their hooves making a firm, solid sound on the dry earth. Elara stood up, Finn's hand still in hers, and watched them drink from the water she had unearthed. She was no longer one person alone. She was the woman who had listened to the land, and the land had answered. The whispers were gone, replaced by the sound of flowing water and the quiet respect of a town that now knew the difference between a fool and a pioneer.